Right on. Well, given the JB focused crowd here, I'll do some quick overviewing of what a delegate is, which is, we just received a message in the Discord from Nicholas that we should call them hooks or something other than delegates, which is super fair. But maybe give some context as to what they do and why they exist and how they got into the protocol in the first place. And it all kind of started back when JB was a V1 protocol that was just deployed and it really couldn't do anything flexible. There were these rules that you could program in that would allow you to issue tokens out and program a declining rate of token issuance, which we call the discount rate. You could burn those to get some funds out of the treasury. What else? Not much else. It was pretty straightforward. You could use it to raise funds and build a community. But there's these sets of rules or sets of things you could do as a project owner were pretty limited. So after those first several, like that season of experimenting was very cool. I think we got very lucky with us having a lot of fervor in the air regarding DAOs and whatnot, which we happen to sit at least somewhat within. And some projects were wanting to do some things more creative with their DAOs, but some found a way to make it work with Juicebox. Others sought new solutions, and it all kind of served to inform a evolution of the protocol that we spent a lot of last year working on, which I think the main feature at the end of the day was that you could, as a project owner, you could bring these hooks into your funding cycles, which are these data structures that define the rules of your project. Like what happens right now when funds go into your treasury, and under what conditions right now are funds allowed to leave your treasury. And those are on-chain, they're guaranteed for the duration of this cycle. And one of the things that was added that you could do during the funding cycle in thinking about how to evolve the protocol was less about doing any particular new thing. I think we had the bases kind of covered, but rather adding the ability for anyone to bring whatever functionality they wanted to into the pay interactions of the project and the redemption interactions of the project. So that's when funds leave the treasury. And the way it works, and I'll scope down to just the pay interaction. It works very similarly on the redeem side, but I think pay is definitely the more common interaction. I will probably go over to Discord and do some screen sharing maybe after this or throughout the week. But essentially, what happens when a Juicebox project receives a payment is the payment goes into a contract called the payment terminal, and that's a payment terminal chosen by the project to operate. Like it's going to operate on this payment terminal currently. Once that payment terminal receives a payment, if the current funding cycle that the project is in has an address set for the data source, is what this kind of bit of code is called, then instead of doing its normal interaction of just printing new project tokens and sending them to the payer, instead it's going to first go to this data source contract and call this hook in that contract, asking it for pay params. Maybe someone can pull some doc links and post them in somewhere on this Twitter page for reference if folks are interested, or we'll talk about it later. So these pay params basically are you're giving another contract the opportunity to roll a custom piece of data to say how many tokens should be printed. So you can customize how many tokens should be printed for each payment coming in, depending on various criteria or various bits of context from that payment. And then it could also kind of adjust the memo that gets posted on that payment if it wants to add some context given what it's about to do. And then more importantly, you specify a set of contracts called delegates that each have a did pay hook on them. So once the data source gives all that information back to the payment terminal, the terminal does its regular pay operations. It adds to the project's balance, it issues project tokens out according to the data it received. Then once it's all done, then it says, okay, which delegates do I now need to go and call this did pay hook from. And it'll just loop through them and call the hook so that project owner can react to something that just happened. And this is most frequently abstracted away and used these days in the Juicebox NFTs, which was a project that we started last June, I think, to try to bring NFTs to the project page. At the same time, we were wrapping up some iterations of this Juicebox version, like the subsequent version to V1. So those two projects kind of informed each other. This NFT delegate that would receive payments from the outside world and do all the project token things, but then also specify which NFTs from a collection it wanted to mint. And so that example delegate helped shape the final touches of the protocol's data source and delegate pattern. And then from there, a few other experiments were built to stress test the thing. There's a few early DeFiFA experiments, kind of a game-making application built on Juicebox. Then also Blunt Finance, or rather it's not called Finance anymore, it's Blunt.fund, which just adds some constraints to what payments can be accepted, such as a limit. So you can have a delegate. It's like, during this cycle, I only want to accept up to 10 ETH. So as funds come in, the delegate keeps track of all the funds coming in. And then if it passes the limit, then it'll revert so the payments aren't counted anymore. So all of the delegates functionality really is in like what should happen next, or keeping track of something to make sure the payment doesn't go through, so that we have more on-chain kind of confirmation of certain rules that we want to make rigid. So that's kind of a little background of how we got here. And I think the exciting bit now is we've built enough of these. Every time we try to build a new one, it tells us a lot about the foundation, kind of the actual bits in the Juicebox payment terminals that hook onto these things, like how they can be improved to make these things really sturdy and powerful. There's always something we wanted, like new, that we want to do to kind of stretch it. But I think now we're at a good point where we've put stress on it. We've gone back to the foundation. We've tweaked a bunch. But now we need to improve developer experience because things are going to start becoming more sturdy, hopefully. And there's always going to be new ideas upcoming. But I think that the current state of the protocol is ready to just have a bunch of cool ideas thrown at it. From a delegate perspective, and these hooks of what happens when funds come in and under what conditions funds go out, and then also how to interact with these things from front ends. It's very hard to build one front end that's like the catch-all for everything these models could theoretically do. We can just kind of prioritize things in different groups and different teams, but there's always creative edges to be designed. And yeah, also going to be trying out some projects this week. So hopefully doing some live screen share style coding and building some hacks myself. And hopefully a lot of y'all will too. If you have ideas, shout out. I think that's like the extent of non-code stuff that's really relevant. Or maybe some folks have questions. Feel free to ask.
Yeah, I'm curious what you view as some some interesting ideas. Like there are a few ideas that we have in that delegate doc, but I'm wondering if there are any things you kind of have on your wish list, like things you'd like to see people build, or even just general patterns you'd like to see people explore.
I think there's a lot of just like very creative things to try that don't necessarily have a hyper functional purpose. If we were to start hyper functional purpose, I like Tom's idea, who's in the chat here, of routing some funds that are coming in directly to an AMM, so that as funds come in, the cost of distribution is kind of borne by the payer into different assets. And so you automatically receive kind of any number of pre-programmed distribution of assets, maybe some stablecoin, some ETH. You can also do that on the flip side, on the distribution side, but having that play itself out on the pay side could be interesting and have some use cases. On the crazier side, I think you could do all kinds of allow listing or token gating based on holdings of other tokens. You can say, like, is the payer also have this other basket of tokens? And if so, maybe give them slightly more tokens, like project tokens, than they would otherwise have got. Conditional or custom multiplier of tokens distributed based on who the addresses paying are. I think you could do some cool things in general with token issuance. Like there's VRGDAs or something, some acronym for like smarter token issuance based on current volume into a concept, like kind of like rate limit. Like, okay, cool, a lot of people are paying now, so issue fewer tokens, and in times when fewer people are paying, and issue a lot more tokens. So have like a different take on how issuance should work.
With something like a VRGDA, could you not do that with just a data source? Like, what would the delegate be doing?
Totally. Yeah, you could do it just with the data source. I think that's valid in this hackathon, I'd say. I think the data source delegate pattern are pretty tied together. It's just kind of things that influence the inbound payment moment and the outbound redemption moment, and kind of having great experiences for actually using these constrained treasuries, I suppose. But you could always add something at the end. You could always give someone some other token of appreciation, or if you have something to do at the end that's like adds to that experience, maybe marks that experience. Like for instance, right now we do these token sales for project owners. So project owners can publish NFTs and payments can go and buy those NFTs. But you could also mint an NFT that's just like a function of the payment. So every payment, you're going to mint an NFT that just commemorates that payment. It's going to just have the metadata knowing how much was paid, who paid it, and it's going to write it really big on an NFT and mint it for the payer. And it's going to sit in their wallet like, yes, I paid the thing. Yeah, I don't know. It's like contract world is pretty open-ended. So it's exciting to, like, if we're going to go the creative route, you can get like real creative and make it very artful, which I think is very, very exciting and equally valid as hyper productive or hyper practical things.
Yeah, makes sense. Maybe this is a bit of an uninformed question, but I don't entirely understand why these are two separate things, like data sources and delegates. What's the reasoning for the separation of concerns there? Like, I guess generally some contract may want to only implement one side or the other, so maybe that makes sense. But are there any like Solidity specific things to worry about there, or is that more of just a separation of concerns for when people may just want to implement one or the other bit of functionality?
So the cool thing is the data source returns an array of delegates. So you can run any number of these contracts. So you can have one delegate that's like its whole job is to say like only payments above 0.1 are allowed. And then you can then add another delegate. It's like the NFT delegate. So you can start to stitch these together. And so if you have a contract that's operating both as the data source and the delegate, like usually like the pattern as it's been used currently usually is 1-to-1. So you could think of them as the same. The data source basically returns just this as like a code chunk to that pay params hook so that it gets its own did pay function called. But if you were to think about delegates as just these did pay functions, then there might be utility to have a separate contract that's just the data source, and it's going to forward a call to like several different delegates and kind of stitch some functionality together that might be related to each other and might not be. It's definitely gets a little bit more delicate when you think in that direction, but it's possible. And I think it just kind of keeps the door open for that emerging without necessarily like forcing us there, because there's a lot to explore still in the delegate as the data source. Like there's only one contract that does it all world. But in general, you should be able to call the pay params function without any special permissions. You should be like anyone in the world should be able to go and call pay params, which is the data source function, and that shouldn't affect any piece of the operation. It's just like a view function to get information. All the actual tangible storing of data should happen on the delegate front.
Thank you. Yeah, it seems like we still mostly have a JB heavy audience, but if anyone has questions, feel free to raise your hand and come up.
Also, if you have ideas in general, like it's a hackathon and definitely we're going to try to make it easy to actually code some of the stuff yourself. But if you have ideas and want to end getting started, that's super normal, and would be glad to help along the way.
This might be a stupid question, but is it possible for delegates and or data sources to be used maliciously? Like, is there any risk in introducing like a custom delegate in this way?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, so when you're a project owner, just like anything you do touches your treasury, It can be used productively or maliciously. And the moment you attach a non-JB protocol address as your data source, which then calls, like it then has information about the delegates it's going to call, that's risk that you're taking on as a project owner. The stuff that's JB protocol oriented, JB DAO and folks have done what they can to make sure that's sturdy pieces of code. And same with those delegates. But even still, things happen and we learn a lot along the way as we put pressure on these systems. Yeah, it's always risky, but I think the core cases of the actual stitching together of how these works gives us as much freedom of kind of movement. So it chooses to give more of that responsibility outward instead of trying to keep everyone safe as like a promise. But if you install a contract as your data source, it could print, a bunch of tokens for whoever really. So it's not any different from having the token, like owner token issuing flag flipped on for that cycle. It's just like, okay, I'm going to give this delegate. It has well-known rules and I trust it to follow its rules and use its power wisely. But it definitely requires like a lot of folks legitimizing it for it to kind of develop like a sense of, yes, we should announce this and tell people to use this, and it is very cool. I think it's definitely worth leading with skepticism. That being said, I think that the hackathon, like, that's a great thing. Like, build scruffy shit, and YOLO it's a prod, and let's see what happens. But don't put a proposal for JB DAO to install it on his funding cycle. I think that's probably a bad idea.
How about risks to payers? Like if I'm paying a Juicebox project that has a delegate that I haven't really looked at, what risk do I face there?
I think it's mostly in terms of like things that you expected that weren't fulfilled. So you expected, like, you're pretty well protected from your account. Like you are probably you're probably already sent the ETH into this contract. You probably, or your ERC20 or whatever, and you might expect something in return that you might not get, but you won't suddenly be missing an extra ETH or something. So I think it's mostly on the reciprocal end.
Yeah, makes sense.
I also put together a repo with a starter template that has 3 contracts in it. One is a delegate contract, a data source delegate contract that does it all. And it also is a redeem delegate. So it reacts both on the incoming payment side as well as on the redemption side. If you fork that, you can scrap what you don't need or you don't want. And then, so that's contract 1. Contract 2 is a deployer of an instance of that contract so that many projects can use the same logic, and you can build contracts that are specific for different projects. So you could have a generic ceiling, like, or maybe a price ceiling. So it only accepts payment up to 1 ETH, and you can install it in various projects pretty easily. And then the last one is a project deployer contract. So you can deploy a project from that contract that will also deploy the delegate and install it into your first funding cycle automatically. And there's 3 functions in that contract. There's one to deploy projects. There's one to stick your delegate onto a project as a funding cycle reconfiguration. I think those 2 are the more relevant ones. So if you clone that, you kind of have the full chain of a bare bones delegate. All it does is programming an allow list. So that an allow list based on payer. You could also build an allow list based on the beneficiary of the tokens, since each payment in specifies which address should be the beneficiary of any tokens that come out of this. So you can do various kinds of allow lists. So hopefully is simple enough to where like you kind of make sense of it, and complete enough to where you can stretch certain bits and get rid of other bits as you need. But the core in it is this delegate contract, which actually has all these hooks. It might be worth hopping in to code for the next 30 minutes if folks here are more JB oriented, and if there's anyone interested in actually going from just audio into like a more visual mode. How does that sound?
Yeah, that sounds great. Were you thinking to do that in Discord?
Yeah.
Okay, sweet. I'll send a message in there. We can move over.
Amazing. Sweet. Yeah, it always feels like like pretty heady and abstract when talking about it just out loud in theory, but like it feels good to really ground it in code, which can sometimes be daunting. It can also be like a little soothing when this is where the rubber meets the road, and if you can grok this, then it should all at least start to come together in a way that you can actually touch and play with. Alrighty, I'll see you all there.